pleasure to be here. You might have seen my face during the last board election of the MAF, because I actually got the honor to represent a lot of you on the board and to represent your interest there. But in my day job, I am the VP of Business and Market Development at netnumber. There have been many big brands out here, so I guess you're familiar with all of them and they don't need an intro. But I will take the liberty to also say a few words about my company and what we're doing. So netnumber understands itself as the leading provider of number intelligence as a service, which is a key term that we phrase because we think that is something that it is not looked upon enough. And why is that the case? So for 15 years now, or for over 15 years, we provide metadata for every telephone number on this planet globally. And that includes, but is not limited to, carrier identification, service assignment, and number portability resolution. And out of the 10 billion something telephone numbers that there are on the globe, about 30% of those we can actually resolve on net with our own global network without any external like processing or live query. For the other 70%, we actually go out, make live queries to authoritative databases, to partners like, for example, Aegis, or to like operator networks and service provider networks. We're also very well known as being the administrator and provider for the netnumber services registry. The netnumber services registry is the single largest telephone number and sender ID registry on this earth. There is no registry that has more than 200 million unique telephone numbers or sender IDs in its single registry. And the NNSR is famous for being the critical infrastructure in the North American market that supports and enables almost all of the programmable communications messaging that there is. And for the US market specifically, that means every fourth, so 1 out of 4 telephone numbers that is engaging in SMS and MMS is registered and enabled through the netnumber services registry. And that I think is a massive scale. And I think that's why Mariola invited us here.
Yeah. Thanks, Marco. And John.
Hello, everybody. I'm John Bruner, the CEO of Aegis. Company's been around for 20 years, providing compliance and brand protection, but also consumer protection to the telecommunications industry. Many who do know us as a very large-scale verification company that does background checks on brands from 170 plus countries. But we actually have dozens of other products that are also designed to protect consumers, protect the carriers' networks, and to protect the brands. The interesting thing is that we also do partner with netnumber, and we are engaged in thousands of transactions with them every day. But we also use their services, dipping into their databases to identify the direct carrier aggregator responsible for a sending phone number that we might see spam or phishing attacks coming from. And one of the things that we hope to talk about today is some of the integration across companies in certain markets where we have created a closed loop compliance model, which is very effective at protecting consumers and optimizing these messaging channels and call channels for brands to use.
Thanks, John. So really to set the scene, I mean, we've heard from some of the earlier presentations today about the process of onboarding brands and what that experience looks like. And one of those first steps has been this idea of registering brands, registering the campaigns. And I think, particularly with both Marco and John here, we have the opportunity to look maybe a little bit broader, not just at what's been happening in Europe, but actually in some of the other markets that have actually taken things in a quite a different scale. Like they've operated, I would say, to maybe a smaller ecosystem in terms of the number of players, a larger ecosystem in terms of the number of active brands and consumer markets. And that really gives us an opportunity, I think, to actually hear about some of the lessons and experiences. So, John, I'm going to start with a big question. What lessons have you learned from operating in the US markets?
Yeah, so what we've learned is that, there's many different channels that, are used by businesses, but also fraudsters today to, engage consumers. And one of the big lessons is if you create processes for registering and onboarding, brands and verifying their legitimacy across all of these channels, not just one or two, and certainly not limited to just the large companies, because 85% of companies we see are small companies. But so one of the lessons learned is, for example, in the US market, we are doing vetting and verification and identity verification of companies across short codes, long codes, RCS, identity APIs, preferred partner programs, branded calling. And what that does is it makes it harder for fraudsters to figure out a channel that they can get into easily. On the flip side, what we learned is you have to balance as well, because while you want to create some friction, you want to optimize that you don't create friction that chases people out of the industry or to other channels. So lesson learned is the ability to do high volumes at low costs and getting just the right amount of balance that helps to prevent fraud, but enables the brands to be protected of themselves and also to be able to engage their customers.
Thanks, John. So, I mean, we've spoken about the word registration. Commonly when we think about this process, it's like a one shot. Somebody's adding data, it goes into a database somewhere. Who knows how it's used? But I mean, Marco, really, NetNumber are part of the fundamental wiring here of the whole messaging ecosystem. So, can you talk to us a little bit about, again, what your lessons and experiences have been, and really how this data is actually used for value?
Yeah, happy to do so. So, if I double down on what are the lessons learned after working with Aegis for the verification and use a good third-party vetter, once you have done that and you've done the registration, many people think, okay, then you put it in a database, and then it sits there in the database. But assuming every Swedish operator would do that with every telephone number, with every shortcode, with every RCS account, and so on and so forth, and they would have all of these registration data sitting in a database, it's fine, but it doesn't do anything there. So in order for the ecosystem to get its benefits, you need a trust framework that in real time delivers this data, this metadata, to the places where it's needed in a format it can be processed. So you need to operationalize the metadata and the intelligence that is being gathered, the evaluations that are being done, because it's not only about data gathering, it's actually also making a statement of, is this good, is this bad, is this risky, is this not risky? And then make this operationally available at the places where it's needed. And I think an important factor is that this view then actually makes sender identity an infrastructure conversation, an infrastructure topic, because you need it at point of registration. You need it at point of when it enters your network. You need the intelligence at the firewall. You need the intelligence at reporting, monitoring. You need the intelligence for complaints. You need the intelligence outside of your own network when you're dealing with reconciliation, when you're dealing with potentially police inquiries, with persecution even, right? So in all of these stages, the metadata needs to be made available and in general in real time. Else, you do not have the infrastructure to enforce the policies you want to incorporate around your sender identities and the verification of it.
Thanks. And in fact, I mean, certainly I'm picking up from both of you that it's not just this one-shot process. I mean, you both use terms like operationalized and loop, and I think it's that feedback and that cycle of learning. I think it's an important task. But just before we do that, I mean, John, a question back to you in terms of, in your experience now, so we've mentioned the US there, but what's your experience now in terms of the differences across regions? Are people broadly aligning on the same requirements, or are you seeing it? Because, looking at this from a brand's perspective, are we going to be faced with a longer and longer, more complex set of questions, or do you see a harmonization?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. There's a lot of groups across the world that are trying to put together, standards for verification and onboarding and identity. GSMA is a great example. They're trying to drive a global standard for RCS verification and onboarding. At the same time, the US is saying, no, CTIA will drive that. I think what's going to be interesting is how do we get to a minimum standard that will work globally? Because what we've found through 20 years of experience is different channels have different risks, different markets have different risks from a tolerance perspective. Identity APIs, we've been doing verification and vetting for 12 years for identity APIs, and that is highly risky data given that it's about a consumer. And so we are vetting software companies with very high standard, and some of the carriers are required a 30-page document on that company, right? Because it's so risky. On the flip side, We have transactions for 10DLC messaging long codes in the US. We're just verifying the company legally exists in the country that they're from, and we're doing that in about 2 seconds, right? So, what we found is different channels, different markets have different requirements. Sometimes it's based on litigation from that country or regulatory actions that have come out of that country. In the US in 2015, there was $350 million fined to the carriers that they had to pay in refunds and fines to the federal and states. So they are very cautious to not have something like that happen again. And so they have very, very high requirements. So the real question is, how do we get standards across multiple markets, across multiple channels? One of the things that we're implementing is if we do a very high level, for example, RCS verification, where we're doing a detailed analysis of that company, we can issue credentials for other channels at the same time at no cost. So they can have fallback to standard messaging, to short codes, to long codes, to toll-free numbers. But then can we also do cross-country? So if I've got US and Canada for RCS and I do the higher standard for the US, I should be able to issue credentials for Canada for free. So we are working very hard not only to try and get cross-country standards that are somewhat more consistent. At the same time, if we've done the highest standard, we should be able to issue credentials for the other areas, markets, channels that are a lower standard. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So Marco, I mean, from your perspective then, I mean, we've been talking about identity. I mean, we've seen some examples earlier again of what that new trusted identity can look like in, for example, on the RCS channel. But, from your perspective, what really is happening in terms of why is identity becoming such an important topic for operators and enterprises globally? What sort of trends are you seeing?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest driver here is the fact that the channel by itself is not trusted any longer. Right, so the trust comes with a presented sender identity. So, and this is changing the role of a sender identity. And particularly if you take a look at like a telephone number that can represent a brand today, it used to just be a routing artifact. And that has changed tremendously how valuable a telephone number is and what scrutiny you have to do in order to make sure that there is no impersonation like spoofing or other thing going on. So if you take a look at how important it is for a brand and its reputation, and you take then a look at what does it mean for like the operator, right? Like if there is no trust framework around these sender identities, the majority of the fraud burden then lies with the operator. So it can't be. So the industry has to come together and actually build a trust framework around the sender identities, create policies, and then also agree on a layer, an infrastructure layer that allows them to enforce these policies in order to check these sender identities. And I think one particular point is that the more convincing the sender ID presentation is, the more attacked it's going to be. So telephone numbers in itself, well, if you have saved a contact, then you get the replacement, and you think it's the brand that you're used to call, that you have in your contacts. If it's an alphanumeric sender ID, you immediately think, oh, that's my brand that's calling me, or that's writing me, I'm sorry. And then with the rich messaging channels, you even have a logo, you have the colors, you potentially even have a tick mark. I don't know. In the future, maybe there is even a jingle that's being played when the message arrives. I don't know. And I think the important factor is also that might change in the future. So sender identity may become more complex. So it's not just like a static list. You do this once. This is the entity. This is the sender ID. It becomes an object that needs to be managed, and it's going to be rather complex and needs an accompanying infrastructure to be operationalized.
Yeah. And do you see consumers' perspectives and levels of trust changing? I mean, if we sort of, let's say, fast forward, let's say 2 years in the future, where we're now starting to see commonplace verified sender identities appearing in our inbox, what do you think consumers' attitudes to risk will be for the other senders that appear in that exact same inbox? Do you think that they'll increasingly believe just everything is in there entrusted, or do you think there'll be an impact and there'll be a dilution of trust? I mean, do you have a thought on that?
I just can speak for my personal view on it, right? But I think there is also evidence there that this is the case. The more elements are shown to you that are trustworthy, and the more of the conversations that you're having are trustworthy, the more your guard goes down. And I think it's a proven point that telephone numbers are less trusted than alphanumeric sender IDs, are less trusted than branded messaging inboxes in RCS or WhatsApp or whatever. So the guard goes down. So what does it mean? It becomes more vulnerable, right? So you need to be extra careful not to allow fraudsters, because the subscriber or the consumer will not by itself be alerted. It will automatically trust anything that arrives through that channel. And I think that's what we want to achieve, right? A fully trusted channel.
Yeah.
And we would like to preserve it also with the older channels as well.
Yeah. And so, John, I mean, certainly, again, what we see is examples with the major brands being, the first to adopt verified sender. But going back to my first question, in the lessons learned, in your experience, are you seeing it's the large brands that are still the folks under attack, or are you seeing it sort of migrate to a different segment of the market?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about this, and Marco, you were talking about this too when we were speaking earlier. Yeah, historically, it's large brands that are being represented fraudulently to consumers. But what we're actually seeing now is smaller banks, smaller insurance companies, stores. And so, the reality is, having been a company that's been in fraud prevention for 20 years, it always evolves. And so while we did see a period of time where it was, all the large banks, that are being represented in fraudulent messages potentially, that's starting to not work as much because the word's getting out. So they start doing other approaches. So the reality is, every time we throw up a block, to block fraud, they try other things. So I would say, yes, we're actually seeing, what came out recently was toll passes, that you didn't pay your toll pass, right? And that was, fraud. So, they try anything that they can for as long as it works, and then move on to something else. We see them jump channels too. When we were in premium SMS 20 years ago, and we started shutting down the fraud and preventing them from coming back because we were registering and vetting them, and we know who they were that committed fraud, they would jump over to direct carrier billing, right? Just the way it works.
And if we think about that sort of that timeline of process from a brand registering, I know you use terms like impersonation and hijacking. Can you maybe just explain those terms and where they sit in that timeline?
Sure. We see impersonations at registration all the time, where it's a company that's not who they say they are, right? It could be a foreign entity registering as a Fortune 500 company, for example. And so that to us is a false registration. We just had a UN entity try to file to do 10-digit long code messaging in the US. There is no database government that can be checked, for a UN entity. You have to understand how their documents are created and actually have contacts into the UN, which we did. And we verified they were falsified documents and it was not a valid UN entity. So that's false registration. On the flip side, we've also seen cases where, for example, in short codes, for example, we are doing the vetting and onboarding. We are doing market monitoring to make sure that campaigns are compliant in market. We're also getting the swipe right report junk data from Apple and Google, tens of millions of those messages every day that we're reading, and we're identifying, is the brand that's supposed to be on that short code the brand that's on there? Well, we saw a government entity sending out fraudulent messages under the right name, but the messages had changed. And the reality was this entity's marketing company got hacked. And upon being hacked, they took over, right? The ability to send messages from that short code. And this is why I was talking earlier about a closed loop compliance model. Vetting is important. Vetting and onboarding and identity verification is important, but there's so many ways that things can turn bad. And by the way, a company can change the day after we look at them. They could be acquired. They could get a new CEO. Right? Things happen. So you need these other things like, firewalling on your traffic, looking and analyzing the complaints coming in from your customers, as well as perhaps live engagement, intercept of the campaign itself to determine that it's running compliantly. So one service, which is what we learned a long time ago, does not stop the fraud. And you have to realize you have to invest in your technology every day because the fraud will evolve. It will change. You shut it down in one place, they're going to find another way in.
Thanks. And I mean, it was interesting as well in the example we saw this morning as well. I saw the nature of the campaigns and the customer engagement was changing. I mean, we saw it was, I think, started off with a Christmas promotion and then evolve into, I think it was a wallet update, you know, something to try and keep that relationship with the end user dynamic. So, I mean, you've talked about change there, John. I mean, Marco, can you give us a sense of scale? You know, I mean, how many different sort of changes do you see it just once in the life cycle, or do you see many changes over the span of a number? And I think you're talking about sort of provisioning events. I mean, what's it look like?
Yeah, when I joined netnumber a little over 3 years ago, I really thought about like these registrations and registries as like sort of like lists, but it's way more dynamic. To give you a scale, so I mentioned before that we have 200 million unique telephone numbers registered specifically for the North American market. And on these 200 million unique telephone numbers, we have about 150 million provisioning events a month. And that could anything be from changing an entry, deleting an entry, creating an entry. Some telephone numbers are being deleted, created like multiple times over a month. It can also mean that a different campaign is associated with a telephone number. It can mean that a telephone number is added to a certain campaign. It can mean that the service provider is changing. It can also be that, for example, the overall chain of custody of a telephone number has changed, right? Meaning that a telephone number that was once within a carrier with a brand and a service provider now was actually ported to another service provider or another carrier, meaning that the entire authority chain for the assignment or the assignment of a campaign to a telephone number and a service provider must be reconsidered and reevaluated. So it's a highly dynamic market. And I think the driver for this is the success of programmable communications and all of the nice experiences that we can create with this. And it's really a highly dynamic real-time data environment that needs to be operationalized.
Thanks. So John, I mean, changing gears a little bit, and one of the things that you mentioned at the start was actually sort of the drive towards getting towards standardization and some of the initiatives. I mean, for example, I know one of the standards the GSMA is looking at with the RCS registration is moving away from just thinking about this as being large enterprise and actually starting to create definitions for additional market segments, all the way right down to sole traders or very small businesses. I mean, what does that mean in terms of what the obligation is and what task is required? Because I would imagine that quite dramatically changes the nature of vetting.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting because, no two companies are created the same. We've seen millions and millions of companies come through our processes and all sizes, all countries, all business types, government entities, nonprofit entities, private entities, public entities. And so the analysis and verification is different across all of these different categories. And one of the things that's popping up now is, individual company owners, where that individual has created the company with their own personal, government ID. So in other words, not a business government ID, a personal ID. I think we call them sole proprietors or, whatever they are. So what's happening is, the mobile operators are starting to push on us to say, okay, we've got to accept these companies, but many of them don't want to take that personal ID number, which they're filing their taxes for their business through. So we're being asked to implement, for example, a government ID verification with facial verification, which also opens up other challenges because if you're a European, you don't want to be giving your passport and your 3 million features of your face to a US-based ID verification company. You want to give it to a European-based one because GDPR will work much better there. So one of the challenges we're facing is we're hooking up to multiple government ID verification authorities. So depending on where you exist in the world, since we look at people from all over the world, we're going to make sure that you're dealing with a government ID company that exists in your region, all right, and will be operating under your laws because we don't need to see the data. We just need to know that person is who they say they are. So it's opening up, more services, but at the same time, it's creating other challenges because, for example, like I said, I don't want, carriers in one nation be sued by individuals that are being forced to give their IDs to, a brand entity that exists in that country. And there's fears that it's going to be, leaked or shared, or that government's going to get access to it without, authority to do so. So, it definitely opens up a challenge. There are also many small businesses, though, that actually register that business, have an ID for that business at the government level, right? They've created, branding in their name. They've created branding in their website and in their email, right? Which is a completely different type of verification for us, which is, much less personal, if you will, when doing verification. So, the different countries, different laws, different regulations, different company types, it definitely means that you have to be very flexible in how you go about identity verification of businesses and brands.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're seeing standards evolve. I mean, Mark, I've got to ask you the crystal ball question. 5 years gone, where do you see this all moving? What do you see as being really trusted identity moving?
Yeah, I think verified identity, especially, is going to be an essential core layer of communications. And it needs to be there for all of the channels with full scale and full coverage. What you see currently is that in some countries, regulators, because of the consumer fraud, are being forced to intervene. So what you're seeing is change of legislation, right? You see instruments being put in place that allow regulators or governments to actually go after not only operators, but also hyperscalers, even in some instances like Australia, even the banking sector. And they all then have to share the burden of fraud and the compensation to the consumers. And I think what you will see in the next 5 years is that some of the, I want to say, point solutions that were put in place to, for example, protect alphanumeric sender IDs in countries like Ireland or whatever, have to grow into more mature, more over-encompassing trust layer for communications, because sender identity is not just a messaging issue. It's a fundamental element of communications, and it needs to be implemented and enforced in an overarching trust layer. And I think that is what you will see in the next 5 years, going away from like static lists, blacklist, whitelist, into an actual like enforceable infrastructure where you have vetted sender IDs with metadata that is then being used to protect networks, to protect consumers, to protect brands.
All right, thanks. And John, same view from yourself? Do you see that with the alignment of services that are coming out? What's your crystal ball telling you for 5 years?
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting because we are seeing major associations pushing to create standardization, which if we continue to support it, I think we'll get there. And then the other concept is, neutrality, independence in terms of, who is doing the vetting and verification work. I want to make sure that there's no reason that they would let the wrong people in. But, on the flip side, I think that what Mark was talking about in terms of live intelligence as well is the fact that, he's, in the middle of the networks, helping to drive where, and what messages are allowed to be sent from which numbers. Other things that we've done there, for example, in some channels is added a risk score for that company. And that risk score determines how many messages per second per minute that company is allowed to send, right? And that reduces risk. And why do I say that? Because, for example, a company that's a month old or 6 months old, there is no history. You have no knowledge of what they've done or where they've been. And so the idea that there's live metadata that can be activated in the traffic as it's going through, and this is happening today in a very, very large market where we're onboarding 6,000 companies every day and putting a risk score on them, and then their traffic is controlled in a central place. That, I think, becomes more of a future to protect consumers. And then, quite frankly, in terms of getting feedback from a vetting and verification and onboarding perspective, if you see that a brand is doing well and that they are not harming consumers, then clearly their score needs to go up over time. So you create a more dynamic, if you will, risk rating on these entities that are registered to engage consumers. And this model has been proven. It's just not expanded to a larger global basis, if you will.